friends in my class, friends at our school, students, teachers, parents, anyone trying to learn while we're at home during this quarantine. I started these videos to help my students review things that we've learned this year while they were at home. But then I realized I could use them for homework help, other students could use them, parents might want to learn about it so they can work with their kids at home. So please like, subscribe, and share. Let's get as many people learning as possible while we're at home during this tough time. Today we are going to be covering a 5th grade topic. If you need me to cover any other topics, just send me an email at connellymathathome@gmail.com. I'm starting with the 5th grade stuff my kids are learning, but I'm happy to do any other grade level. And today's topic is going to be adding fractions with unlike denominators. If we have time, we'll also cover subtracting fractions with unlike denominators, or I'm deciding whether I want to make a new video with that if it gets too long. But let's get started. First things first, there is a video on this playlist for adding and subtracting fractions that goes over how to make an equivalent fraction. So make sure you watch that first, because that will help you with this and make it a little bit easier. So let's look at some fractions that do not have the same denominator. So we're going to start off with 1/2, because I like working with that one. And we're also going to think about 3/4. So it is a little bit difficult to say if I have eaten half of a pizza and 3/4 of a pizza, we can't add those parts together because they're different sizes. Okay, so we have half of the pizza here, and then I eat 3/4 of this one. You see that the pieces are clearly different sizes, and that is why we cannot add these together when the denominators are different. So when I say unlike denominators, we have denominators that are not the same. They have different size pieces, so we can't combine them. Okay? So what we have to do is we have to make them the same size pieces. So let's get started. When we're thinking about halves and fourths, we want to think about, is there a relationship there? I need these denominators to be exactly the same. So I'm wondering, is there a way that we could make halves into fourths and make an equivalent fraction? So the key is you want the same exact amount when you're making the common denominator. A big mistake is kids will be like, okay, you want me to change the denominator? I changed it, they're both fourths, but that's not correct. It needs to be an equivalent fraction because you need to be adding the same exact amount. Okay, so if I want to add 1/2 and I want to change this denominator to fourths, I have to make sure I'm using the equivalent fraction, which is 2/4. Okay, if you're in my class, I've taught you to make a box on the side, your equivalent fraction making box, and I want you to do the work over here and then come back because we end up having too many numbers all over the place. So if I wanted to make fourths, I know that I have to multiply my denominator by 2 to get to fourths. If you watched the last video, you know to make an equivalent fraction, you have to multiply the numerator and the denominator by the same number. So if I know I wanted to make fourths and I know that to get there I had to do 2 times 2, that means I automatically multiply the numerator by 2. So 1 times 2 is 2/4. Okay? I have my students do the work over here because then we're not trying to keep track of the times 2 halves everywhere. It's just too much. So we're going to take the 2/4. As soon as you make an equivalent fraction, you're going to plug it in. So it used to say 1/2. I am putting 2/4 here. It's the same amount. It's an equivalent fraction. And now I can add 3/4. Now that we have the same size pieces, we're able to combine the numerators. Okay, so your goal is to make the same size pieces in the denominator, then you can combine the numerators. So just like adding whole numbers, we combine the numerators and we end up with 5/4. 2 plus 3 is 5, 4, and 4 stay the same, and we end up with the same size parts. There's also a video about changing an improper fraction to a mixed number. 5/4 is the same as 4/4 plus 1/4. So we end up with 1 and 1/4 as our final answer. 1 and 1/4. Okay, so to review what happened, we had, unlike denominators, they were not the same size pieces. If you don't have the same size pieces, you have to make a common denominator. We did that over here so we didn't get all the numbers mixed up. Once we found that 1/2 was equivalent to 2/4, we put 2/4 here where it was 1/2, and then we were able to continue with adding fractions as we normally would. As a reminder, from 4th grade, the denominator does not change when you're adding fractions. Only the numerator will change when you're adding fractions. And then down here, we did changing an improper fraction to a mixed number, and there's already a video out there for that. Okay, so let's try another one. I'm going to make my equivalent fraction box a little bit bigger because I'm going to make it a little more challenging here. So let's say this time that we are working with 1/5, and we're adding it to 2/3. So you notice that we have fifths and we have thirds. Those pieces would not be the same size, so we have to make common denominators. Now, last time I only had to change one fraction because I knew that I could make an equivalent fraction with fourths, but this time I can't change fifths to thirds, that's not going to work, and I can't change thirds to fifths by multiplying by a whole number. So we have to think about what multiple do they have in common. Okay, so if I'm thinking about which multiple they have in common, I might write down on scrap paper and count by 5s, and then I might count on scrap paper by 3s and ask myself, which number do they have in common? And once I see the lowest common multiple, that's what I know I'm going to do with the denominators. Okay, so I decided that 5 goes into 15. I also decided thirds can be changed to 15ths, so that's what I'm going to do. Some kids also like to just say, I know 5 times 3 is 15, so I know I can make 15ths. But just be careful, I'm going to do one more example after this, 'cause sometimes it's not the lowest common multiple. So let's go over to our equivalent fraction box, and let's start with 1/5. I want to make 1/5 into 15ths. I decided that's what the common denominator should be. So I like to write it like this and ask myself, what do I multiply 5 by to make 15? And 5, 10, 15. So we know in order to make 15ths, I multiply 5 times 3. Then you're going to take what you learned in my Making Equivalent Fractions video, and you know that if I multiply the denominator by 3, then I also multiply the numerator by 3. You have to multiply the numerator and denominator by the same number. So here, I end up with 3/15. Okay, I'm going to take this and I'm going to write it right underneath. I know that 3/15 is the same amount as 1/5, so I write it right underneath so I can keep track of my work. Then I say it's time for 2/3. I go over to my equivalent fraction box and I say 2/3. I know that I want to make 15ths, so I ask myself, 3 times what got me to 15? 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. Okay? If you're in my class, you should be practicing first in math, so we have those facts down. Just saying. All right, so 3 times 5 is 15. If I multiply the denominator by 15, I also multiply, by 5. I multiply the denominator by 5. I also multiply the numerator by 5. Always, always, always the numerator and denominator by the same number. So 2 times 5 is 10. So I know my equivalent fraction, the equivalent fraction to 2/3 is 10/15. So I'm going down the page to make sure that I am doing equivalent fraction for this. I have the same amount. Equivalent fraction for this, I have the same amount. We don't want to be changing the amounts that we have. We're making equivalent fractions, so they're the same amount. Then, just like we talked about before, your denominator is going to stay the same when we're adding. As soon as you make a common denominator, there's no changing. You are not combining 15 and 15, okay? Please don't do that. 3 plus 10, we're going to add our numerators, and we get 13/15 as our answer, okay? Parents at home, I want to tell you something that's confusing sometimes. After the students do this first making equivalent fractions, they multiply the numerator and denominator by 3/3. Sometimes they want to go down here and use the same number, 3/3. Okay? It's difficult to keep track of because there's so many steps, but you want to make sure that they're deciding what numbers to multiply the numerator and denominator by to make the common denominator. These will not be the same. They might sometimes, but they will not be the same most of the time because you are starting with different denominators. Okay? So just pay attention to that. If your kid continues to make the same mistake, that's a really common one, so I wanted to point it out because it happens in class all the time, and it's important that we point that out to them so they know you're trying to make the common denominator. These two things will not be the same. All right, so let's try another one. This time, I just want to show you something that happens with students. Okay, so let's say that they're adding 4/6 and they're adding 3/4, and they say, oh, I know what the common denominator is going to be. It's going to be 20/4. And that is a common denominator. It could be 20/4. But just so we can get in the habit of knowing there's a lowest common multiple, they can go through and say, let me count by 6s. Let me count by 4s. And we do have 20, sorry if my knee is in the way. We do have 24 in common, that's true. But we also have 12. Okay, both answers would be correct. Both answers would be correct. But if we wanted to think about what is the lowest common denominator, it would be 12. So either way, students can do it either way because no matter what, the answer would be correct. But we just want to think about the lowest common denominator. So we're going to make 12ths. Equivalent fraction box time. We write 4/6 and we say we're going to make our denominator 12ths. You ask yourself again, 6 times what is 12? 6 times 2 is 12. So what do we multiply our numerator by? The same exact number we multiplied our denominator by. So 6 times 2 is 12. We're going to be doing our numerator by the same number. These two numbers should be the same. So we get 4 times 2 is 8. So what is equivalent to 4/6? 8/12. I go in depth with this in the equivalent fraction video. So if you want to take a look at that, it's helpful. So 8/12 is the same as 4/6. Then I plugged it in here so I can make sure I'm keeping track of my work one step at a time. And now it's time for 3/4 in the equivalent fraction box. So I'm going to put 3/4 in my equivalent fraction box. I know I'm trying to make 12s. So I want to write that down to remind myself, you're making 12s, you're making 12s, you're making 12s. Then, so my students are probably laughing at this particular moment. Anyways, I asked myself, how do I get from 4 to 12? What did I multiply by? I multiplied times 3. So what do I do with my numerator? The same exact thing as my denominator. 3 times 3 is 9. Okay, so 3/4 is equivalent to 9/12. They are the same amount. So I end up with 9/12. Final reminder, you are not changing the denominator when you're adding or subtracting. You are keeping the denominator the same. You are going to combine the numerators. 8/12 plus 9/12 is 17/12. And please take a look at my changing improper fractions to a mixed number video. I'm going to take out a group of 12/12s, that is a whole, and I have 5/12s left over. So that is how we are going to be adding fractions with unlike denominators. I'm going to do one example of subtracting because everything is exactly the same except you're going to subtract the numerators. All right. So let's try, we're going to do 9/12 minus 1/4. Okay, so let's give a story problem context. I like to do that sometimes. I have 9/12 of a pizza. I ate 1/4 of that 9/12. How much pizza do I have left? All right, so I picked these numbers on purpose because some of my friends might be realizing that you can either change 9/12 and make an equivalent fraction with fourths, or you can change 1/4 and make an equivalent fraction with 12ths. It's up to you. If you watch my video about making equivalent fractions, I show you can divide the numerator and denominator by the same number too. But let's continue. So let's do 1/4 just because that's what we've been doing all video. So I know that if I count by fours, 4, 8, 12, I can make 12ths. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to change just the one fraction. I come over to my equivalent fraction box. I know I'm going to make 12ths, and I ask myself, what do I multiply 4 by to make 12? I know it's going to be 3. So if I multiply the denominator by 3, you should be saying it with me. You're going to multiply the numerator by 3. 1 times 3 is 3. So 1/4 is equivalent to 3/12. I'm going to write it here. I'm going to make sure I copy this down correctly. And then the denominator does not change when you are adding and subtracting fractions. You are combining pieces that are the same size. Well, we're subtracting. So anyways, so 9/12 minus 3/12 leaves us with 6/12. Denominator stays the same. And just so you know, you can divide the numerator and denominator by the same number. Just a little review of the video I keep referring to. 6 divided by 6 is 1. 12 divided by 6 is 2. So 6/12 is the same as 1/2. Okay? So, big things to remember when you're adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators. If the denominator is different, you have to make them the same. But that does not mean that you just change the denominator. What we mean by making a common denominator is finding the equivalent fraction. Because we don't want to change the amount that we're subtracting, you find the equivalent fraction and then you plug it in. Okay? If you have to change both fractions, you want to find the equivalent fraction for both. Please, please, please do not just change the denominator. The goal is that you make an equivalent fraction. They both are going to have the same denominator, and then you're able to either add or subtract. Okay? If you have any questions, call me or text me. If you're in my class, if you are not in my class or don't know me personally, you can send me an email at conleymathathome@gmail.com, and make sure to go take a look at my video about making equivalent fractions if this part was confusing for you. It'll help you out a lot. Thanks. Bye.